Fire Emblem: The Sacred Stones is the 8th game in the Fire Emblem series and is widely considered to be the easiest game in the series. This is largely because of the massive power gap between player units and enemy units, which is so big that even if you want to ignore grinding, the enemies are so weak that it doesn't even matter. So, how would you make the game harder? An individual by the name of Mecha made a patch where every playable character has their growth rate set to 0%, making them rely on their base stats, stat boosters, and promotion items. This event has widely been considered to be the start of 0% growth playthroughs, at least in the international community, and eventually people have started doing low turn count playthroughs of other games in 0% growths, including FE8. As of 2022, every game on every difficulty has been completed on 0% growths, but FE8 is one of the hardest games to do on 0%, weirdly enough. This actually is because the endgame bosses are surprisingly tough, and the units that can go toe-to-toe with them really want some investment to do so. Regardless, here's the history of FE8 Ephraim Route 0% Growth's LTC. To get an idea on what makes 0% growths different from vanilla gameplay, we should start with alterations in notable units' performances that affect their viability. As a start, Franz's viability is on a timer due to the lack of growths, Vanessa is reduced to just flying utility, and Ross's only valuable contribution is by being an early game water walker that's flatly outclassed by Dazzle. I also mentioned that the late game bosses are very difficult to deal with, and I wasn't kidding. Final Chapter Leon, while being very slow at only 5 attack speed, has enough magic damage that even your beefiest units would want the pure water to avoid being utterly destroyed. And don't even get me started on Fomortis. The only unit that can reliably survive a round of combat against him at base is Dusel with Garm equipped, and Dusel's counterattack isn't even that accurate, it's only 49 displayed hit rate. While all of that may sound a bit depressing, and quite frankly it does give other units a chance to shine where they otherwise wouldn't, like the aforementioned Dusel, a great knight strong enough to be a carry in a casual 0% growth playthrough after Chapter 10, or Garrick, a unit in a 3-way tie post-promotion for the second fastest unit that you can get in 0% growths with decent stats to boot. Even units that are only temporarily viable, like Garcia or Joshua, have a more highlighted role due to what they can contribute in such a limiting setting. I suppose I've talked enough about some of the differences, so why don't we get into the LTCs? Starting with Reploids. At the time, no real 0% growth LTCs for Ephraim route existed, and the only 0% growth LTC that I could find from the time period was Donna 151's Erica route LTC thread, of which only the Chapter 7 clear still exists, although it's unlisted. Reploids eventually decided on going through with his own run. Here's a summary of how his run went. I'll put the full run in the description, but here are some highlights. Chapter 1 was nothing out of the ordinary, except that Seth was using more of his Silver Lance. We'll get into why this is a bit notable later on. Reploids intentionally wasted a turn in Chapter 4 to get Arthur a bit more EXP. He needed Arthur to do warping and some other shenanigans that we'll talk about later on. While Reploids didn't initially get the Killer Lance in his Chapter 5X clear, he redid it for Ephraim route and got it then. He also redid Ford's EXP routing to get him to promote by Chapter 9. Reploids got a 3-turn clear in Chapter 6, where he just walked Seth over to the boss using his innate movement. This helped get Arthur a bit more EXP. Reploids went with a 4-turn strat of Chapter 7, which is fairly more reliable than the 3-turn that further LTCs will go for. Reploids actually got an 8-turn in Chapter 8 because he wanted to get both left-hand chests and get Arthur to promotion in this map. In Reploids' 5-turn clear of Chapter 13, he promotes Tana in this map, and Garrick actually promotes to Ranger. This will be apparent on why it's a big difference later on. In Reploids' 6-turn clear of Chapter 14, he actually goes to visit the secret shop to buy a barrier and 2 physics staves. He needed these for staffing purposes a bit later on in the run. In Reploids' 6-turn clear of Chapter 18, he actually uses the silent staff on Gorgons to help get Soleil to warp Thanks to Salah having access to Warp, Chapter 20 was a 2-turn for Reploids. Reploids finished the run with a turn count of 101. Compared to LTC runs of FE8 these days, this turn count isn't anything to write home about, but what Reploids did was establish a baseline. His run was the first 0% growth LTC of Ephraim route, and it set a baseline that any contender to the LTC record would have to match. Reploids' run stood as the record, but only for about 7 months, and that's because a new contender entered the arena. Next up to bat was Kebe. Kebe brought his own rerouting for certain maps. As a note, Kebe didn't allow himself to use strategies that relied on Pierce, a skill that ignored enemies' defenses. Some differences between Kebe's run and Reploids' run is that in the early game, Kebe actually trained up Ross for a turn save in Chapter 7. This also means that he is able to recreate Don Don's 3-turn clear, which involves naming. Kebe also discovered that he doesn't need to train Arthur for his routing to work out, as he figured out that he only needed Natasha to get to B-rank staves for all the staff power that he needed. This alone saved a turn in Chapter 4, and maybe another few in Chapter 8, an EXP which could go to other units like Ross or Joshua. The staffing rework meant that the secret shop in Chapter 14 didn't need to be visited anymore, nor did he get the Chapter 5 Guiding Ring since he wanted to prioritize getting Ross EXP. As a reference point in time, this run started to be uploaded a few months after Mecha's 100% growth LTC series finished, so some things may be recognizable, like a turn save in Chapter 6 or Hawk King's 6th turn in Chapter 5X, although this resulted in 4 not being able to promote until the middle of Chapter 9. Lastly, Kebe prioritized Seth to get to S Swords, because he needed to tank a late-game Gorgon, and Alhoma was the easiest way for Seth to survive. The most notable thing about Kebe's mid-game is that he started to use strategies that involve break-swapping weapons. In the GBA games, if a weapon is broken, then it vanishes from that unit's inventory, and the next weapon up is equipped if possible. Kebe notably uses that to great effect in Chapters 13, 15, 16, 18, and 20 to save turns and increase reliability by switching to more favorable weapons. In terms of EXP management, Kebe actually skipped on promoting Tana. With his routing, Tana wouldn't need to promote, since for him it was important to have 2 flyers with 15 aid. The reason for this is to be able to carry Dusel and Garrick, 2 very important units for his run. As for the main carry of the run, Kebe switched from Dusel to Garrick. One of the reasons for that is because Garrick needs 1 less speed wing to double the Demon King with Garment Whip. Also, Garrick as a hero has the same movement as Dusel, but with them mounted terrain penalties, so certain terrain was easier to cross for him. Because of a smaller need for staffers and larger turn saves earlier in the run, one may have worried that Kebe wouldn't be able to match Reploids' turn counts in the late game, but in the end, Kebe was able to match and even save on Reploids' turn counts, even without a Silhouette with Warp. In Chapter 18, for example, Kebe had saved the turn because of more aggressive use of Warp and Rescue, arguably even just using stabs in the first place. Chapter 19 was also a turn save on Reploids' run thanks to Natasha having ranked for Rescue. Kebe seemingly had prematurely broken the Warp Staff in Chapter 20, but he assured his audience that it was entirely intentional and planned for. And so we awaited his upload for the final chapter, and waited, and waited. Kebe's run remains unfinished, even today. With all the turn saves he found by rerouting, he had a turn count of 84 going into the final chapter, and a projected final turn count of 88, but we never saw that he's cleared the final chapter, so we can't say for certain. People were wondering when he'd upload the final part. After all, in his Chapter 20 video, he said that he wanted to learn video editing. But eventually, the weeks turned into months, and the months into years. It would be another 2 years since he last uploaded until someone would pick up the torch he dropped to finish the job he started. And that someone was me. Man, it feels weird to be a part of this game's LTC history, but here I am. To tell you the truth, I never anticipated I'd do it in the first place, but eventually I guess I said, screw it, I'm gonna finish what Kebe started. That was the start of how it happened, but I didn't just copy-paste all of his strategies in routing. A notable difference between my run and Kebe's run was that I was fine with using strategies that relied on Pierce, as in the end it didn't matter all that much, since I wanted to make sure that the run stayed reasonably faithful to Kebe. For context, I only used it for 3 bosses, one of which was the Chapter 12 Cyclops, but since Kebe also got the same turn count, it doesn't matter. The other 2 were bosses in the final chapter. Since they were so bulky, I felt that Pierce was the best way for me to deal with them. While Pierce's strategies do exist, they do not change the turn count at all, so I feel it's a moot point. Like I mentioned before, not all the strategies were just copy-pasted from Kebe's run. I actually brought my own improvements, like getting Ross to promote a bit earlier, getting Seth to S swords a bit earlier, getting Ford to promote before the start of Chapter 9, and most importantly, a turn save. Sometime before Kebe last uploaded, a user by the name of Jumpy23, aka Putman, found a way to save 2 turns in Chapter 10 while getting all the important side objectives. That's how I was able to get a 3 turn where the limit used to be a 5 turn. The only real side effects was some rerouting of staves and having to scrap the 2 supports Kebe planned out, but honestly it was very manageable. While in my run, Cormac died right at the end, as at the time I thought he had to for my strategy to work out. Jumpy actually found a way for him to survive, and even landed the killing blow on the final boss, although this doesn't alter the turn count at all. With all that being done, my final turn count was an 85 turn run. I saved 16 turns from Reploids' run, thanks to Kebe's rerouting and Jumpy's turn save. After I finished my run, 2 turn saves were found between my run and the next, both of which were found by Jumpy. The first of which was an 8 turn of Chapter 9. I knew it was theoretically possible by rescue dropping Seth about 2 tiles ahead, but I just couldn't figure out the RNG while planning it out, since I still planned the Angelic Robe on Ephraim. Jumpy rerouted that Angelic Robe to 4 to increase reliability, and he re-rolled stats to make sure that certain enemy units were 1 round KO'd by Seth or Kyle. The other turn save, albeit more theoretical, was a 1 turn in Chapter 17, since it required Tana to promote, something that would need to be routed in since my LTC didn't go for that. Jumpy was fine with someone else planning out another run, but after being called a white noise user, he decided that enough was enough and he was going to do his own run. Jumpy introduced a whole bunch of turn saves into his run. 2 of them he brought to the community in between my run and his. Only 1 other was because of better optimization in Chapter 11, but the others came through massive rerouting. What's the secret? Super Cormac. Why wasn't Super Cormac used before? He's a flyer with good stats, and thanks to Wyvern Knight, he has access to Pierce. My best guess is that previous runs in routing did not want to rely on Pierce as well as being worried about the Fomortes fight. As I said before in 0% growths, his stats are so strong that the only unit that can survive a round of combat against him was Duso, but only if he had Garm equipped. That is probably why Reploids opted to use him as the carry. Duso could actually double if he had all 3 speedwings that you could find throughout the main campaign, but it helps that Duso was able to effectively dispatch a lot of the late game bosses that would be a pain in the ass to deal with otherwise. Kebe's routing used Garrick instead because he needed 1 less speedwing and had more skill innately, which made him more reliable at dealing with these bosses. Garrick just needs an Angelic Robe to survive a round against Fomortes if he has Garm equipped, and Garrick wants the Angelic Robe anyways to deal with some of the more punishing bosses like Kellic and Morval. Regardless, Jumpy was able to get through them. Super Cormac uniquely saves turns in Chapters 15, 16, and the first part of the final chapter, while also being more reliable in Chapters 17 and 20. This is due to his higher innate movement than either of the Garm Bros in Duso or Garrick, even if it means a horrible drop in reliability in some maps. Another development came in the form of Warp Natasha, which is the entire reason that the final 1 turn save exists. But the last notable change from Kebe's routing was that Tana was trained again, but she only needed to be promoted by Chapter 18, as opposed to 13 from Reploids' run. After landing the final blow on the Demon King, Jumpy's run stands at 79 turns. And that's where the record stands today. In the span of only a few short years, the LTC has gone down from 101 to 79 turns, nearly a 22% drop in the overall turn count. Who knows where the game goes from here? Turn 4 may have even been reached, but new strategies are discovered all the time. I don't know about y'all, but I await the future of this game. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see y'all the next time.